Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on peer reviewing in sociology and for joining us today. So one of the things that we like to do with the Canadian Sociological Association is do a traditional land acknowledgement. This is our practice in the CSA, and it's based in the principles of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and it's founded on the principles of respect and reconciliation. So I'm Dr. Rochelle Stevenson, and I'm honored to live, work, and play on the traditional and unceded territory of the Secwepemc Nation in beautiful Kamloops, British Columbia. So I would invite folks to take just a quick minute and acknowledge the lands on which they're currently sitting, if it's appropriate for you to do so. So couple of just housekeeping issues for today. One of the ways you can interact with both myself and Dr. Cole and Dr. Wrenn is to use the Q&A button, which is at the very bottom of your screen in the Zoom toolbar. You can upvote questions or downvote questions by giving them the thumbs up. So this will also prioritize the questions that we will focus on during our Q&A session, but we're going to try and get to all of the questions that you may have about reviewing in sociology. So just a super quick introduction to who we are on the panel today. So we have Dr. Corey Lee Wrenn from the University of Kent, Dr. Matthew Cole from the Open University, and myself, Dr. Rochelle Stevenson from Thompson Rivers University. And with that, we're going to throw it over to Corey.
All right, thank you, Rochelle. Hi, everybody. Share my screen. Okay. All right, we looking good? So hi, my name is Dr. Corey Wrenn, and I am an American sociologist living in England, and I'm a member of the BSA, but I'm also past chair of the Animals and Society section of the American Sociological Association, and I'm co-founder of the International Association for Vegan Sociologists. So we've got a lot of sociologists on board today from various associations, and that's very exciting. We originally put on this talk as a means to train our student editorial board for the Student Journal for Vegan Sociology. And in planning that, we quickly realized that I don't think that there's really been too much, if any, opportunities for people to learn about what actually goes on in the peer reviewing process. And perhaps you're like myself, where you just kind of fumbled your way through it and learned just by doing it. But how nice it would have been to have a resource like this to actually go through the process and figure out what is it in the first place and what is expected from it. And it's not just doing it that we learn how to do peer review, but also being on the other end of that and experiencing good reviews and poor reviews. So I'm going to start out in this part of the presentation, and I'm just going to give you an overview of what peer review is and the basics of how to do it. I'm assuming that there'll be people in the audience who've never peer reviewed before, maybe don't even really know what it is. So I'm designed this to kind of walk us through the basics of it. And then Rochelle and Matthew are going to come in with some more detail on how to do that, the artistry of a good peer review. In fact, I think it's a real honor to have them on board today, because I just know that they're really, really good peer reviewers, and they take a lot of compassion and care in the process, and they're really good people to learn from. All right, so without further ado, what I hope to do is talk about what peer review is at the very beginning, and then again, we're going to talk about the details on how to do it well. So basically, in sociology, we're a science, and the idea behind peer review is that you don't just publish any old thing. It has to actually go through a review of your peers, so that by the time it makes it to publication and it can be used by scholars and scientists and policymakers and so on and so forth, it has been really tested for rigor. So the peer review process is intended to improve, or at least validate, the reliability of the study, the validity of the study, the quality of the study overall. So it's this opportunity for the field really to give it a stamp of approval before it goes off and becomes science that people will use and apply in the real world. So what happens is that before any of this work gets published, a draft of that work in progress is going to be sent to an editor, be it a book editor or a journal editor. Most of what we're going to be talking about today is about journal article editing and revision and peer review. But I will have a little bit of note on the book process as well. But for the most part, we're going to talk about articles. So it will be sent to your editor, and then the editor is going to send it to peers, people who specialize in that area. And therefore, you should theoretically get the best of the best, determining the quality of this work before it goes out into the real world. Most of the time, these reviewers are going to be anonymous. There's kind of new on the frontier peer review processes that some journals are experimenting with where they're not anonymous. And we can talk about what benefits might be behind that. But for the most part, it's a blinded review. So you don't know whose work you're reviewing, and and the people who's writing it don't know who's reviewing it. So this is a collaboration. I think when you first get started with peer review, it seems like a test. Like you're getting all geared up and putting your battle armor, getting ready to go through peer review. Can I make it through? But actually, I think the more appropriate way to look at peer review is that this is an opportunity for collaboration. And I know, speaking from my own experience, there have been so many things that I have published that would never be the quality that they are, or some of the ideas or theories would never have even been applied if it had not been for my peer reviewers. So if the peer review is done right, it's actually a great privilege, and it can be very invigorating, very exciting. So yeah, this is a collaborative effort. So you see this as almost kind of an anonymous workshop that you have with people in your field. It's very rare for papers to make it all the way through peer review without some kind of revision to be requested. So that's the first thing you just need to get out of the way. You're going to deal with rejection, and you're going to deal with a heavy amount of criticism. That's just the process. That sometimes you have people who are just nasty to be nasty, but really, again, thinking about this from the viewpoint of it's a work in collaboration. You really want to have some feedback. You want to make your paper stronger, and you want to take advantage from various scholars who have different levels of expertise and experience. So it's to go through peer review and not have your work bounced back with requests for revisions would be like, finding a unicorn. It's very, very rare. The level of involvement that you're going to get with peer review is going to be variable. The qualifications of the reviewer are going to make a difference. If you have someone who's just, has a general understanding in this field, you're going to get some general feedback. But every once in a while, I'll kind of hit the jackpot, if you will, and that the writer and the peer reviewer will be just so closely aligned. You'll see a lot of really in-depth quality review. And the editor really works hard, I think, to make sure there's a good balance of people who have a general understanding of the field and people who have a really specific alignment with the topic area. So it really does depend. And some of it's a bit of the luck of the draw, who's available to do it. So why would you do this? You don't get paid to do this. This is a free service to your field. So why would you want to do it? I think the number one motivation for a lot of people is just to keep in touch and keep on top of what's going on in your field. So for me, I specialize in critical animal studies and vegan sociology, and this is a really an emerging field. And so for me, I really do look forward to the new stuff that's coming out, and I get to know about it before it publishes. So if you know anything about the publishing process, it can sometimes take a very long time for the work from the point of submission to the point of publication. The longest one, the record one for me, was about 3 years. Like I've written and published a book in a shorter amount of time than a couple of my journal articles. So it can take a long time, and it's nice then to be in the middle of it and know about this emerging research. I also highly recommend peer review, especially for young scholars and early career scholars, because it's an opportunity to network with editorial staff. And the people who are on editorial staff are often leaders in the field who are doing that very vital service, and they're considered experts in that topic area. So by doing this service and kind of collaborating with them, it's really an excellent opportunity for networking. This also gives you insight into the publishing process. You get a lot of the behind the scenes mechanics about what is expected of a good article or a good book. And I think it's also very useful for serving the field. And for the folks who are the panelists for today's presentation, we do vegan sociology and critical animal studies, and we're all very motivated by a sense of social justice, and we want our field to grow. The more science that serves other animals, the better. So for me, I do feel quite a bit of duty in doing peer review for young scholars, emerging scholars, and just peers in general who are doing this very vital, important research. And I want to be there to support them and help make their work stronger and more useful. This is also useful for folks who are wanting to go onto the job market or who are hoping to be promoted. Not all universities recognize that. Unfortunately, I'm in the UK, and the UK has a much different system of rewarding scholars for their service work, and peer review is not really up there. But in the US, it's much different, and I think Canada as well. But especially for graduate students, if you want to be able to put some stuff on your CV and show that you're engaged with your field, this is an excellent way to do that. So here's a little chart I've made about what happens with an article once it's submitted. So this is useful for you as an author, but also if you're doing peer review for the first time, this is pretty much what you can expect. The first thing that happens is the author will submit using either the online submission form, or in some cases, journals, it goes directly to an editor's email. Then the editor looks at it, and the editor will theoretically, sometimes they just send it on, they don't really look too much into it, but a good editor will look at that submission to see, is it even worth bothering peer reviewers with this submission? Does it fit the journal's aims? Is the writing quality up to speed? And so on and so forth. So it's right off the bat, you're kind of, the gatekeeper is the editor. And if the editor thinks this is not a good fit, they won't bother peer reviewers, because again, this is a service and peer reviewers do not get paid. So if it does look like it has a chance, then the editor will send it off to the peer reviewers. Then the peer reviewers will be that first major decision. Generally 2 to 3 peer reviewers at this point, and they will say, okay, it looks like we can work with this, or this is just not salvageable. And then they will report back to the editor. So the editor, of course, is not normally, sometimes the editor does read the whole thing, but usually the editor is just relying on the peer reviewers because there's a lot of work that comes through their desks. They have to allocate that work. So they'll rely on the advice of those peer reviewers. Is this something that can be salvaged, or should I let down the author and advise them to go elsewhere? So if you make it past that point, generally the most common response is that the reviewers will say this needs major revisions. At least that's my experience. Very rarely do I say minor revisions, or even me as an author, very rarely do I get minor revisions on the first round. Usually it's major revisions, because you're dealing with, there's a lot more chefs at the pot, right? There's a lot more chefs in the kitchen. And so you have to kind of deal with lots of people's different expertise and expectations. At that point, it goes back to the author. The author makes major revisions, and each point along this process, it depends on the journal, but it's usually about 2 to 3 months between each point of this. So the reviewers get 2 to 3 months, the author gets 2 to 3 months to revise, goes back to their peer reviewers, and so on and so forth. I would say on average, and we'll see what the other panelists have to say, but for me at least, on average, there's about 3 engagements with the peer reviewers for an article that ultimately makes publication. So the big one is at the beginning with major revisions. Usually the second time around, it will be minor, sometimes major revisions, but the second time around is usually a big chunk of work as well. And then the last time is oftentimes when the paper is pretty much ready and the reviewers may find a few extra things or more specific detailed things that they should be fixed before the article is ready for publication. So at that point, then it will go from the editor over to the copy editor, who will sometimes, depending on the quality of the journal, go through that article and give it a good proofread, make sure everything makes sense, and then send those proofs back to the author to sort out. So at that point, the peer reviewers are off the hook. They're not really involved with that process. So yeah, it's quite complicated, and we do this on purpose, right? We want to make sure our science is good, sound, valid, reliable stuff, and the peer reviewers are going to be absolutely comfortable before that research goes off into the world and is used. So what happens from your end when you are the one who's doing the peer reviewing? This is basically what happens. You'll get an email out of the blue. If you're a graduate student or an early career researcher and you want to be more proactive about being a reviewer, you can go to some of your favorite journals and actually register into their bank of peer reviewers. But usually you won't have to do that because these journals are often really desperate to get people to do this free work, and you'll get emails without having to solicit them. So sometimes that'll be personally from an editor, which I really like because you get to build up a relationship with that editor. Or sometimes you just get an automated email where the editor is doing it behind the scenes, choosing people in the system. Again, there's no money for this, so you do need to be thinking about, do I have the time? Is this a good fit for me before you commit to do this? Usually there will be, like I said, 2 to 3 months that they'll give you to do this, but there's really a lot of pressure on journals nowadays to be a little bit more speedy with the publication process, especially because in places like the UK, university systems, the funding they receive is now really tied to the amount of publications that university is producing. So they don't have time to wait around for 3 or 4 years for a journal article to come out. So increasingly you're seeing that time window of availability to do the peer review shrinking. So I've actually just agreed to one where they gave me 4 weeks, which is not that long in academia when you have a lot of other responsibilities. What will happen is that when they're asking you to consider, do you want to do this or not, they'll send you an abstract and sometimes a manuscript, and it'll be blinded, so you don't know who's written this, and they'll say, okay, does this look like something that you can review? Sometimes they'll give you evaluation forms in order to guide the review process, and sometimes they just ask you for some general feedback and leave it free form. I think for people who are starting out and they don't really know what they're looking for in assessing a good quality journal article, the evaluation forms can be very useful. I think these are more common. It's more rare that I'll have a journal just say, what do you think, without giving me some criteria to respond to. Usually if you're peer reviewing, there'll be 2 to 3 or 1 or 2 other people who are reviewing along with you. I think this is pretty much standard. Sometimes it's even less. It's just you and 1 other person. And I have a suspicion that one article I'm reviewing right now, I might be the only reviewer, which is not really that ethical. Matthew Cole has told me he actually had an article in a much higher ranked journal and had 5 reviewers, which for me is quite unheard of, but that might have something to do with the quality of the journal. If it's a top ranking journal, they really want to make sure it's good quality research coming out. If there's a tie or there's some uncertainty in the review, the editor can actually step in as a tiebreaker and make a decision based on their expertise. Before you agree to do this assessment, the first thing that you need to do is think about, are you even qualified to comment on this? And kind of the unfortunate part is that because this is an unpaid, uncompensated type of service, a lot of the journals are really desperate to get people to do it. And like I said, in the UK, there's no real reward or incentive for UK researchers to do this service. We're just doing it out of the goodness of our hearts. We can't say, hey, look what we did on our promotion applications. Universities in the UK don't care as much. So unfortunately, there's a dearth in a lot of ways of good quality reviewers. And this is one of the reasons we're happy to give this presentation today, because increasingly graduate students are asked to do this kind of work. Unfortunately, also, there's a lot of journals that are predatory journals or lower quality journals, and they just send out requests for people to review indiscriminately. And so I am declining invitations to review probably once every couple of weeks that are just from really obscure journals, topic areas that have nothing to do with what I specialize in. And it's just clear they're kind of throwing a dart out there to see who will pick up on it. So you need to be careful. Don't kind of get swayed by like, oh, wow, they think I'm an expert and I should definitely take them up on this offer. You should always be really critical. Do you think you really do have the expertise to offer quality feedback, including the methodology? And if you don't, so sometimes I'll get an article that's very heavy in statistics, and I'll just simply say to the editor, my response is only to the part that I'm qualified to talk about, and I'm not a statistician. So you need to rely on another reviewer for that part. And so that's fine. Sometimes editors will kind of cobble together teams that are specialized in different areas. That's totally fine. Also, you want to think about your ability to commit. One of the really frustrating parts about the peer review process is every once in a while you'll get a reviewer on board who takes 8 million years to get the review done, and they just throw it on the back of their to-do list and forget about it. And this is one of the reasons that I've had articles that take 2+ years to get out, because you're waiting for months and months and months. Sometimes I've had to wait a year just to get peer review back, which is extremely unprofessional. And at that point, if you're the author, you might actually consider withdrawing your article and going elsewhere, because that's really bad practice. So you really need to be thinking about not just your expertise, but do you have time to realistically get this turned around quickly? And also, is the journal's reputation worth your time? And this is just the sad part of it. If you're not getting paid to do this, and you're not getting much in return for this, the one thing that you can get from this is the reputation of the journal. So if it's a higher ranking journal, you almost always want to say, yes, let me on board. I want to be a part of this. But if it's like an open access journal, an obscure journal, if it's not like really in your area of expertise and you're just really passionate about it, you might question, like, is it worth the time? But also, if you haven't got a lot of experience in peer review, maybe you do go with these lower ranked journals or these obscure open access journals just to get that practice. But I do a lot of peer review for those lower ranked journals just because the community that I'm a part of, I'm happy to be in that kind of network in there and be a service to my field. You also want to think about conflicts of interest, and this maybe Matthew Cole could talk more about this when he talks about kind of the nastier parts that happen in peer review. But I've had situations where there are people who have a direct conflict of interest reviewing my work in the past, and it's been really problematic. So for instance, I published a book which had a whole chapter on atheism, and one of the people who, sometimes you can figure out who's doing the reviewing because our field is so small. And one of the people who were doing the reviews was a committed Christian theorist. And so he had all these problems with atheism. It was like it's hard to get through it. And I've also had people who work for certain charities that I was critiquing in my work, and they were like, I'm on the board of this charity, and how dare you, da, 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 da. If you have a conflict of interest like that, you're not really in a good position to offer good, unbiased feedback. So you want to be thinking about, is it appropriate for you to even be a part of that team? Some things that you might want to look for, and I'm just going to go through this part quickly because the other presenters are going to have more on this, but one of the things you might look for is this an interesting research question? One of the easiest ways that you can say, I don't know if this paper is ready for publication, is that it's just kind of not really doing much. It's not really adding to anything. A lot of times you'll have student papers that are submitted to journals now because of the incredible pressure of the job market nowadays. But that's one of the giveaways, is that they're not really asking anything novel. They're probably, this is a term paper that they've tried to turn in for publication. Are they offering some kind of unique perspective? So maybe they're not reinventing the wheel, they're just looking at the wheel from a different perspective. Do they have an interesting theoretical contribution? Is the methodology unique or useful? Is the data that they have collected useful or interesting? Is this even a replication study? So I think that unfortunately a lot of replication studies don't get the credit they deserve because they're considered, not so jazzy or novel. But we do need replication studies for a good solid body of science. So if it looks like a good replication study, you might also say, hey, this could be something useful. Some general things you want to consider is the paper being fair to all positions? So sometimes you might have a paper that's really polemic and it's got an agenda, but I'm a radical author myself. I'm a radical theorist, and I've had reviewers push back on me and saying that you're just being too polemical, which sometimes makes me bristle. But on the other hand, you can kind of tell when someone is not really being fair to the literature or to different perspectives. So that's something you want to pay attention to. Likewise, is it up to speed on the literature? Sometimes that might be where you can come in and guide them, but sometimes it's an indication that they really haven't done the work and the paper's definitely not ready yet. Really focus on the sociology. Don't get too hung up on the grammar, especially if this isn't their first language. You don't want to be just hammering away at that. On the other hand, I will say this, I really appreciate it when the reviewers point out some of my grammatical or spelling errors, because sometimes you've looked at this paper a million times and you just don't catch them. It doesn't stand out to you anymore. And sometimes not all journals will have a good copy editor at the end of the process, and you really will be thankful for those reviewers who point out those issues. However, I just don't want you to think about that has to be a major priority and you spend extra time doing that stuff that's not really what peer review is supposed to do. I know the other panelists are going to have different ideas about this, but for me, I spend about 1 to 2 hours when I peer review. If it's an especially intricate argument, or it's really dense with its theory, or has a lot of history you got to sort through, or the methods are really complex, that might take more time. Sometimes you can tell pretty quickly that this article is maybe not ready or not even appropriate, and you don't want to spend 2 hours reading through it word for word because it's just clearly not going to fit. or, here's the major things that this author needs to focus on, and there's no point at this point or this stage of the peer review to focus on the details. So you start skimming, knowing that you can get back to that at the next stage of the review. But be very careful at this point, because if you start giving people advice on how to revise that paper and you've skimmed it and you say, well, I can't believe that you didn't include Karl Marx on this. Where is Bourdieu? Bourdieu must be mentioned in this context. And then on page 15 or whatever, they talk about Bourdieu and Marx for ages because you've skimmed it and you didn't see that. That's one of my biggest pet peeves, is when I get reviews back and they start making all these critiques and it's clear they didn't even read the article. So be very careful when you do that. We're going to give specific critiques and you've skimmed. You don't want to look unprofessional. Also, do you want to make sure you're not overwhelming that author? Because remember, there's other people who are on this team and there's going to be multiple stages of revision. So at the first stage, which is usually a major revision request, make sure you got the basics there. These are the major things for that author to focus on. And don't start going on with like 10 pages of revision requests, because that author is just going to have a meltdown. Nobody likes to have their work critiqued. It's a part of the process. But if the one thing we can do is just not overwhelm people, knowing that, again, there's other reviewers who are going to be giving them a to-do list as well. Again, if this paper is just obviously not publishable, and you can often tell on the first 2 pages or so, is it really worth your time to go through the fine-tooth comb to give them lots and lots of feedback? Probably not. So at that point, what I'll do is just give them a general overview of what I think the issues are and some recommendations, especially if it's a reject. You just don't want to spend a lot of time on that, unfortunately. But still be kind and give some advice, but you don't need to go through with a huge amount of revision requests if you know that the article doesn't have a chance. But also, again, Matthew and Rochelle are going to go more into the detail of the positive parts you want to focus on. But just very quickly, what I would suggest is talk about what's strong in the paper, especially at the beginning, before you just start launching into the things that need to be fixed. What's good about it? Why have you decided this paper is worth keeping? Highlight what redeems the paper. What makes this useful to the field? Why you were hooked on it. If it's not suitable for this journal, do you have suggestions for other journals? But be careful there as well. I think another big pet peeve of mine is that since I do animals and society research, we have like very few journals that specialize in that field. And it's my interest to expand our field into other areas, into other journals. And so sometimes reviewers would say, oh, this should go to Society and Animals, the journal, without even really reading the article. And for me, I feel like that's a form of ghettoization. So just because an article is about feminism, you don't want to say automatically it must go to some feminist journal. So be judicious about that. Don't just kind of write something off because it looks like it's not necessarily in that journal's area. Pay attention to why that author may have chosen that. But sometimes authors don't really pay attention to the aims of the journal, and they do get it wrong. So you may have suggestions. And don't write anything you wouldn't say to their face. I think this is probably the biggest takeaway from today's panel. Don't write anything you wouldn't say to their face. There's real human beings on the other side of that screen, and their work is their baby, their little infant baby. They put so much work into that. So they care about it, and it hurts our soul a little bit when people critique it. So be very kind when you offer advice and feedback. And remember that you are the gatekeeper. People's jobs depend on their publication. People's name in the field depends on their access to publication. So you want to be really fair here, because people's lives are really on the line here. Their well-being and their way of making a living. So yeah, it should be seen as a collaboration, not a smackdown. This is an opportunity for people to come together and make something really awesome. Okay, so I'm coming close to the end here now. I'm about to turn it over. But just to let you know, you're never alone with this. The journal will always have their codes of practice up on their website. Like I said, oftentimes they'll offer you a form on things that you should be looking for and respond to. Sometimes, I think this is most common, they'll have 2 different forms, the one that goes to the author and the one that's private and goes to the editor. So you may not say to the author, this article clearly looks like a student paper and the writing is terrible and it has no business in this journal. But you might say that to the editor, because the editor is relying on your advice in order to make a decision. So you'll always have an opportunity for private feedback to the editor. lesson learned from me, always save a copy for yourself. First off, I keep a copy and put in my portfolio just to, as a record of the service I've done to my field. But also you want to keep a copy on your computer, because one time I spent hours filling something out and I didn't save a copy, and for whatever reason the form didn't send correctly online, and the editor never got it. And then the editor said, can you redo it? And I said, you know what, I'm too frustrated, I can't redo it, I'm not going to redo it. So always save a copy for yourself. It's extremely frustrating. So the last point is that, yes, you don't get paid to do this, but there are opportunities to get something back from this. There's this new Publon kind of platform, and not all journals participate in this, but for a lot of them, when you publish or when you do the peer review thing and it's finished, it will ask you, do you want to be listed? And it'll keep a record of your service on that website. I don't know how many other people use it, but I use it when they give me the opportunity. With book proposals, and this is the one bit I did want to say about book proposals. This is a whole different species of things to deal with, but these often are paid. And if you're being asked by a publisher to do a book proposal review and they're not offering to pay you, you're getting scammed. So this should always be paid. Sometimes they'll say, we'll give you free books, but they really should offer you the opportunity for actual payment, cash. And this ranges anywhere from $60 to like $200. You can also, and this is what I do, and I recommend you do the same, is in your CV, you can say invited referee for whatever journal it is or for whatever publishing house it was. And that definitely is a really good indicator of the service that you're doing. So for when you're going on the job market, it looks like, oh, this person is a respected expert and someone who's a good team player. And again, not all institutions reward reviews. My last institution did in the United States, but here in the UK, not so much. So you really want to think about, do you have the time to allocate to tons of these? And I will say this as well for you early career folks out there and for grad students. The further you go in the career, the more of these review requests you're going to get. So I used to get one every few months. Now I get one every week or two. It's quite frequent. Okay, so that's it. I'm going to stop sharing and I will turn it over to Rochelle. So again, if you wanted to use the Q&A box as we go along, and we'll respond to those at the end of the talk.
Awesome. Thanks, Corey. So I think the next person who's going to be just chatting about peer review is Matthew. So Matthew, take it away.
Thank you, Rochelle. Just share my screen. Bear with me. Okay, so hopefully you can see my slides okay. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you a bit about the ethics of peer review, kind of conceiving of this process as an ethical responsibility. And just before I get into that, I'll tell you who I am, first of all. So I'm a lecturer in criminology at the Open University in the UK. My background is very much in sociology, though. I identify as a sociologist, I would say, still. I've recently become involved with the Student Journal of Vegan Sociology as a member of the advisory board, which is how I came to be part of this panel. And also I thought this is a wonderful opportunity to talk about the peer review process, because it's something that I've done quite a lot of. I've learned a lot from it. I've enjoyed it a great deal, but it's something that no one really talks about. Certainly when I was doing my PhD, it's not something that was kind of formally taught for sure. And it's kind of something that seemed to happen almost in secret. You know, you get invited to do peer reviews and you do some and you get something out of the process, but then it's kind of gone. The reviews go back to the editors and nothing else happens. So I think it's really nice to have this opportunity to kind of open out the process and discuss it and share our experiences and take your questions at the end, as Corey was saying. So my own background is also in vegan sociology, critical animal studies, that kind of thing. And that certainly shapes my approach to the peer review process as well, as I'm going to share with you. If I can just remember how to advance my slides. Here we go. So here's a brief overview of what I'm talking about. First of all, looking at what are these ethical responsibilities as a reviewer. And I think there's kind of 4 different aspects to that. And then looking at the actual process of how do you do peer review empathetically, which I think is a really important part of the process. And I've broken that down into two aspects. One side of being an empathetic reviewer is to be kind to the authors. And the other side of it is to be rigorous, because you don't do anyone any favors by not being rigorous. And then I'll just sum up with some more of the benefits as I see them from approaching peer review as this ethical process. So what are these ethical responsibilities as a reviewer? Well, first and foremost, your responsibilities to yourself. I think it's always important to bear those in mind. So Corey was saying a lot about what you should consider before you accept an invitation to do a review. And I think it's important to think of these as ethical questions as well. So on the one hand, you need to be realistic about your own position, certainly your own competence. So it can be, it's a great thing when you get your first invitation to peer review, I would say. It's very flattering, it's rewarding. You think, oh, great, I've kind of arrived as an academic, or in this aspect of my academic career, I've arrived. So there can be a strong temptation to kind of say yes to everything, especially early on. But you do need to, pause, take a breath, read the abstract carefully, consider if you have something valuable to offer as a reviewer before you accept it. But by the same token, be kind to yourself in terms of your limitations. So nobody is omnicompetent. Nobody is omniscient. So there are going to be gaps in our knowledge, and that's fine too. So again, as Corey was saying, a paper can be reviewed by a kind of team that the editor can put together with a kind of jigsaw of people with different kinds of expertise. So between you as a group of reviewers, you can do a really good job. So don't feel like you have to know everything about a paper, but likewise do be mindful of your own limitations. Now, the other aspect of that is your workload, of course. So as Corey said, 1 to 2 hours as a minimum, I would say, is what you need to devote to a review, and maybe scale that up the less experienced you are, perhaps. So when you're doing this for the first time, it's quite likely, like most things, you're going to be relatively more nervous, more anxious, more concerned to get it right. So it'll take longer. You might reread your own comments multiple times, and you might go through a drafting process of your comments before you send them back to the editor, which is absolutely fine. So do make sure you've got enough time to do it justice within the time frame that you've been given by the editor. Again, as Corey mentioned, the pace of reviewing is accelerating all the time. I spotted we've got a question about that coming up, which we'll answer properly later, but the time frame is contracting, I've noticed. So I just recently got a request to review something in a week, which is wow. So I've had to say no to that one because I can't do it in this week coming up. So be mindful about that. Now, the second ethical responsibility I'll put here is to the author or the authors. Again, as Corey was saying, they've worked really hard on this paper, and their work deserves your full attention because of the effort that's gone into it. We all know how difficult it is to write at whatever stage of our careers we are, and having that work trashed or skimmed or not paid full attention to is, incredibly insulting, demoralizing, undermining, and all of that. So make sure you do give it your full attention, whatever you think about the merits of the paper, whatever your take on their argument, and so forth. Then the responsibilities to the journal and to the editor or editors. So anyone who has journal editing experience will know that that's a very demanding task in itself. And the editors really are relying on us as peer reviewers to help them expedite this process. So it's really important that we bear them in mind as human beings, as people working really hard, doing a crucial job within academia. And of course, they are in turn serving the journal itself and the journal's reputation. So your review is helping that process. You're helping to sustain the reputation of the journal for publishing high quality work by doing a really good job as a reviewer. And then finally, but by no means least, in fact, I would say first, really, in terms of order of importance, your responsibilities to the research participants or the beneficiaries of the research. So I think we always need to be asking ourselves, who's going to benefit from this research being published? Who potentially might be harmed from this research being published? Now, hopefully, questions of harm do not arise too often, but they might do. They might do, depending on your field. But part of your job, your ethical responsibility as a reviewer, is to maximize the benefits for the participants by making the work as good as it can possibly be. So working as we do in vegan sociology, our principal beneficiaries would be non-human animals. So I'm always asking myself, is this paper serving non-human animals in the best way it possibly could? If not, how can I help that process? How can I help those beneficiaries through my review? And if you're reviewing work in vegan sociology, you're coming at it with a shared value system as the authors, by and large. So it's not as if you're doing something that conflicts with what the author wants to achieve. So how do we actually go about doing this? So as I said, I've broken this down into two aspects. Firstly, being kind, and then being rigorous, which I'll go on to. So the first point I put up here is avoid the temptations of power and vicarious revenge. So I expect everyone watching this has had experience of their own work being savaged to various extents, being, heavily critiqued, torn down, ridiculed even. And peer review is sometimes where this process can happen. It can happen in conferences when you get a, particularly aggressive or hostile questioner. It can even happen in supervision meetings at times. It can be in your PhD viva, it can happen all over the place. And sometimes it seems to be that the anonymity of peer review can unleash these kind of vitriolic comments at times, which of course is extremely upsetting. So if you've experienced this, and you probably have to some degree or another at some point, don't take peer review, especially your first chance to do it, as a chance to take vicarious revenge, to kind of project onto this poor author, anonymized author, and say, right, now's my chance. Now I've got the power. Now I can really kick back on this stuff that was done to me. And I'm sure none of you would set out to do that. But sometimes when you get reviews back, you suspect that some of that might have been going on, judging from the comments you get back. So that's something to be very mindful of, I think. Now, the second point I've put on here, the perils of anonymity, well, that's very closely related. I mean, before the internet was a thing, and now we're kind of surrounded by internet trolls and so forth. People who are already involved with peer review probably could have predicted it, right? We could have looked at the peer review process and said, okay, this is what's going to happen when this thing called the internet kicks off. It's going to be mean, because people are going to be hiding behind this veil of anonymity and just kind of unleash their verdict on things that they disagree with. So that can happen. And if it happens to you, just bear in mind that may well be the reason why, this veil of anonymity, but don't do that yourself. Approach this as an ethical process. Be kind, even if you disagree. And as Corey said, write as if you aren't anonymous. Write as if the author will read your comment, will know that you wrote their review, even if they actually don't ever find out. And that involves writing respectfully, of course. So again, this is especially important when you disagree with the paper, which certainly can happen. I mean, I've had reviews where I've read the abstract and I thought, oh, great, this sounds really cool. This is the kind of thing I'm into. And then you read it and the argument goes in a really different direction to what you're expecting or to what the abstract set out. So then part of your review can be, well, the abstract doesn't really give a fair representation of the paper, but you still need to be writing respectfully and tempering your comments, even if you're kind of completely at odds with the argument. And I think that's really important because academia can be extremely harsh anyway at the best of times. There is this huge pressure in the jobs market. As Corey was saying, keeping our jobs is dependent on so many metrics these days, not least publications. So, no one needs more harsh criticism in their lives, no matter what the merits of what they've written. Phrase it kindly, I would say. And that's why I've ended this slide with a point about giving some warmth in your review. So if you've enjoyed the paper, don't be afraid to say so. Share the pleasure that it's given you. Share what you've learned from reading the paper, how it's expanded your knowledge, your understanding. And also, I would always encourage you to bookend your comments with some positivity. So any of you who've been involved in teaching, you'll know this. No matter how bad the work you're marking, start off by saying something nice about it, find something good to say, and end with something positive as well. Even if the bit in the middle is, heavily critical. I'm sure you all know the metaphor, which I won't repeat because we're live streaming on YouTube. But yeah, always try to inject some warmth even when you disagree. So moving on to the kind of flip side of this empathetic reviewing approach is to be rigorous. So the counterpart to avoiding the temptation to be too critical or to take vicarious revenge is to avoid the temptation of sympathy, avoid over-identifying with the author and with the author's position. So I think this can be a particular risk when you're working in a new field that has few people working in it, that's just taking its first steps to trying to become established within your discipline, within sociology or whatever it is. That's certainly been my experience working in vegan sociology. It's taken a lot of work by colleagues to kind of get us to this position where it's now a thing that's kind of, I would say on the verge of acceptance, if we haven't been accepted already, that this is kind of, it's perfectly fine to be doing this kind of work. But it's a struggle to get there. And when you're in that position, it can be very tempting indeed to see something in your field and think, yes, I agree with where this author's coming from. I'm going to give this a free pass. I'm going to give it a really positive review because we need this work to be out there. So resist that temptation, definitely. You're ultimately not helping the author by doing that. In fact, you could be damaging the author's reputation potentially if you're kind of getting work out there that could and should have been stronger and damaging the field that you want to establish. So avoid those temptations. No one really benefits if poor quality work gets a free pass. Another tip I would give is to recap the core argument of the paper. And this is a good way to avoid falling into that trap that Corey pointed out of just skimming a paper and writing a kind of slapdash review. So if you force yourself to write down what the core argument was, you're going to have to pay attention to the paper to make that convincing. And by doing that, you're showing the author that, yes, I have actually read your paper. I know what it's about. I think this is what you were trying to achieve with the paper. So I think that's important. Attend to the specific aspects of the paper. That's something that I think Rochelle is going to get into more depth about, so I won't dwell on it. But as Corey mentioned, often you'll have an evaluation form. You have set things you're asked to comment on. And if that's the case, then, give each one your full attention. And then finally, your own expertise and values are important. So here, what I'm urging you to do is to point out where things are missing. Don't be shy of doing so. If you think, well, how have they not mentioned such and such, Bourdieu or Marx or whoever it may be, then, make those points for sure. But equally, again, accept your limitations and don't attempt to cover them. So don't attempt in your review to, expound on areas of expertise that you don't actually have. And it's fine to put in your confidential comments to the editor, which is often a separate section of a review, to be upfront about that and say, well, I couldn't comment on, the statistical analysis because it's not my field. So you'll need another reviewer to fill in that gap. If no one has done that, then you might need to send it out for an additional review. So just to wrap up from me, this is what I think you can gain from this process of treating it as an ethical process of peer reviewing. So it does build your own knowledge and competence. Again, as Corey was saying, you learn a hell of a lot from reading what's coming out in your field before it's been published. It also builds your confidence and you can establish your reputation. If you send your reviews back on time and they're useful, editors will ask you again. And if it's for a journal in your field that has a good reputation, that's really good for you. and it benefits the authors. So this is a collegiate process. Academia is always collaborative. I mean, nothing we do comes out of a vacuum. It's always based on reading, prior work, talking to colleagues, etc. So it's not an intellectual beatdown. This is not a chance to write, okay, now I'm going to give someone the pain that I've suffered in a conference or in my own reviews or whatever. And of course, the journal and the editor wins from you helping them sustain their reputation. And as I was saying, most importantly of all, I would say the beneficiaries, the participants can benefit. If you can increase the impact of the article by making it higher quality, that's hugely important. And ultimately that benefits the research fields that we're working in and gives us all more space to do the work that we really care about. So I'm going to wrap up there, mindful of time. I think I overran. And I'll hand over to Rochelle to finish off. If I can remember how to stop sharing.
Awesome. Thanks, Matthew. So I am going to round out the presentation today just with some practical strategies. So Corey and Matthew have actually done a really great job of outlining the bulk of what peer review entails. So one of the things that we kind of in an ongoing joke, I guess is maybe a good way to put it, is the dreaded reviewer too. So as Corey mentioned, sometimes there's 2 or 3 folks who are reviewing a particular manuscript. And the challenge here is that there's always that one reviewer, typically that one reviewer, who makes maybe unreasonable requests, who maybe is a little bit more critical and a little bit less constructively critical with their comments. And really what we're thinking about with this entire webinar is how do we avoid being that reviewer too? And how do we move our discipline forward? How do we support new scholars? How do we support existing scholars and having the best work possible be out into the field and consumed by other academics and students and used for teaching and research and establishing the field in a bit of a different way. So I'm going to be talking about a couple of practical strategies to avoid this, and especially in terms of things like timing and how you can make sure that you are not that dreaded reviewer too. So just a recap of the goals. So again, I feel like, both Matthew and Corey addressed this really well. I just want to recap it because we all kind of explain it in our own ways. But I really see that this is the ability to strengthen the discipline with excellent research. So pushing areas of research forward, establishing and engaging in well-founded debates and supporting that debate, that back and forth, because that's part of, it's in our disagreements sometimes that we move the discipline forward. But it's also about strengthening the work of emerging and established scholars. So it's about constructive critique. So you can disagree, but can you do so constructively? Are the comments that you're making or the things that you're pointing out, the goal is to strengthen the paper to make it better, as opposed to tearing somebody down. So again, thinking about that kind and direct comments, avoiding kind of that tendency to oversympathize, but also avoiding that tendency to be over harsh. So there's kind of this lovely middle ground that can be challenging to get to sometimes. So the first thing that I would suggest in terms of practical strategies is to really check in with yourself and ask yourself, how are you feeling right now? So if you are thinking about sitting down and doing a peer review, you've been approached by a journal, you have this great article, you're really excited about it. Are you excited about it? How are you feeling? Are you hungry? Are you sleepy? Are you grumpy? Are you dopey? So think about reviewing when you're feeling positive and rested. So you don't have a million other things on your plate. It's not the very last thing on your to-do list and you're like, oh, I have to get through this, because that's not really conducive to that empathy. That's not being ethical or necessarily responsible if you're already kind of feeling a little bit grumpy or you're not having a great thinking day or you're tired. So again, when you're feeling very positive and you're feeling very rested, are the better spaces to be in. So I kind of joke and say that review when you're feeling more happy and doc than the others. So you're feeling very happy, you're positive, you're feeling like you're having a really good thinking day, because sometimes we have those days where we can't carry a thought in a basket. So maybe that's not the day when you're going to be doing an in-depth peer review. So again, check in with yourself about how you're feeling, because that will help in making sure that you have the capacity and the interest and the dedication to provide a really good quality, empathetic, but positive comments in terms of strengthening the paper. The next thing is about time and attention. So thinking about how are you planning on reviewing? So people have different structures in how they review. So as I mentioned, make sure that the review is not the last thing in your to-do list. Set some time aside for it. Allocate time in your schedule or on your to-do list, and really make sure that you are paying attention to how much time you're putting into it, because that'll also help you estimate time for future reviews. So as Corey mentioned, like 1 to 2 hours at least. I tend to do about 1 to 2 hours, but I do it in a bit of a different way. So I tend to do the in steps, because I have 2 kind of formats here that are suggestions. One is the all at once. So you block sufficient time. I would say if it's your first review, or if you're kind of new at the peer review thing, or if it's a paper, again, maybe with more intense theoretical frameworks or a more challenging methodology to manage, then about 2 to 3 hours. So you kind of sit down 2 to 3 hours and you get your review done. This might work for you. I tend to do mine in steps. So what I'll do is I'll schedule blocks of time. So I'll schedule about 1 hour each. And then I do 3 reviews. So 3 kind of mini reviews. I'll do my first review. So I'll do a read with my first impressions. So is this paper even worth moving forward into the other reviews? Are there substantial challenges with it? What are kind of my first comments? Then my second block is the close read and my detailed comments. So this would be maybe I might take a little bit of time and do a bit of research in the middle. For example, if they're missing a section of a literature that they need to be engaging with, I might suggest a couple of authors for them to include, or those kinds of things. And then my final stage is the review of the review, to make sure that it makes sense, to make sure that my comments are compassionate and constructive, because my goal is to strengthen the paper and to support the researcher or the scholar in becoming a better researcher and a better scholar. So it's about strengthening and building up those strengths, and making sure that if I was a little bit tired or I was a little bit hungry, that didn't come out in my comments, that my comments are all things that I would say to the reviewer's face if they were, I would say the author's face if they were sitting in front of me. So that time and that attention are things that you really need to balance in terms of your review. So those are just 2 kind of strategies, 2 ways to think about organizing your time. But also I would really advocate making sure that when you are doing a peer review, to make sure that it's on your schedule. It's not necessarily the last thing on your to-do list. It's something you just have to get through. So kind and constructive critique. Both Matthew and Corey raised this, and one of our goals for today was really to think about how can we be compassionate and ethical and really strong reviewers for our peers. So really it's about being kind and don't say anything that you wouldn't say to somebody's face, which is the way that I kind of balance my own peer reviews. So if you're thinking about kind of constructive critique, there's a couple of really clear questions that you can ask yourself. Is that, why do you disagree with a particular point or argument? Is it because it's not how you would approach the issue, perhaps from a methodological or theoretical perspective? Is it because you wish you had written this paper, so there might be a little bit of professional jealousy there? Again, this is normal. It can be normal. Like you're like, oh, this is such an amazing paper. I wish I had written this. But maybe that's a point where you're kind of evaluating yourself and being a little bit more reflective about your comments and your critiques and the space in which why you are disagreeing. But then you also want to think about the flip side. Why are you agreeing with particular points or arguments? Is it because the author is saying everything that's completely in line with your own theoretical and methodological leanings? Possibly, but think about ways to improve it. Think about maybe different perspectives. Think about, again, that broad spectrum of knowledge that you are bringing, which is why the journal has reached out to you to do the peer review. So kind of ask yourself and reflect on those two questions. Why are you agreeing and why are you disagreeing? Because this will also help in building that kind of constructive critique. A couple of strategies in terms of how you can make sure that your critique is kind of constructive is read your comments out loud. This is a way for you to say, actually, when I read that out loud, that doesn't sound all that supportive, or that sounds a little bit too mean, and that's not really what I meant. It's a good way to kind of test how that could be received by the particular reviewer or particular author, sorry. The second thing is, imagine that you received this comment or review. How would you respond to this? Is this something that you would say, actually, you know what, that really hurts? Or is this something that you would say, actually, you know what, that's a really good point. And by adjusting this or paying attention to this or fixing this, it'll make my paper stronger. That's the response that you are hoping for from the person that you are reviewing the paper. That you really want this to be a strengthening and constructive and supportive process rather than a tear down process. So you don't want to be a reviewer too. And Matthew mentioned this as well, but balance those really positive comments, but also those critical comments. So for every limitation, my practice is to try and find a strength. And sometimes this is a little bit more challenging than others, but it's a matter of looking for those things that you can highlight as being really great points. You say, actually, it is really excellent that you brought in this diverse literature. However, here's some authors that you might want to include, or maybe have you thought about this kind of limitation to your methodology? It's a really interesting way to apply it, or something like that. So really trying to, again, kind of that constructive critique. So it's about building that paper up. The thing about the kind of constructive critique is think about your motivation, your reactions to the paper, and also the comments that you're making, and reflect on those. And so here's just a couple of practical strategies that you can use to make sure that your critique is kind and constructive. So the bottom line, don't be a reviewer too. We've been talking a lot about different ways that we can provide constructive criticism, and because that's really what it is, it's constructive criticism. So a couple of just like takeaways: be well rested in a positive frame of mind, set aside sufficient time for review, whatever that looks like in your schedule, and however it is that you try to kind of balance that in your schedule, but make sure that you have sufficient time to do so, because that way you don't feel rushed. And think about the review as an opportunity to strengthen the discipline, to support the development of scholarly work, and to support the development of scholars. And then that kind of constructive criticism with both strengths and limitations. So that is the conclusion of my kind of practical strategy chat. And now I think I'm going to turn it over to Corey to chat about and go through some of our questions and take questions in the chat.
Excellent. Thank you, Rochelle, and thanks, Matthew. Really excellent. I'm learning something as well. Okay, so we do have a few questions, and we can, we're at the hour mark, but I think we definitely have time to address the questions we have here thus far, four of them or so. The first question we can probably answer pretty quickly. Why is it that, Fatima asks, why is it that reviews take so long? My answer to that would be because journals don't always put a cap on how long peer reviewers have to review. And like I said, sometimes reviewers can just take months and months. It just gets knocked down on their to-do list. What do you guys think?
I think that's probably my experience as well. I've actually been guilty of that myself. I will kind of once or twice. But yeah, certainly I think it's just, and it's also just recognizing that it's coordinating the multiple schedules. It's not just coordinating like one person. But when you have a team of reviewers, some folks might take longer than others. It might have to go back to the editorial board. The editorial board might have different kind of ideas, or the editor might kind of get stuck on their desk in the queue of folks to respond to. So there's a variety of different ways of reasons why it might take so long.
Yeah, and I agree with all that, of course. And something that might cause the editor problems is when you get really conflicting reviews, which certainly I've had on some of my work. You get one reviewer who loves it, another one who absolutely hates it. So then the editor's in a hard position. What do they do? So I think that's part of the reason as well. And I've had work that's been sent out for an additional review before when the editor couldn't decide between conflicting verdicts. So there's yeah, lots of things can delay it. But yeah, it can be so frustrating as an author because you don't necessarily know what's happening behind the scenes.
Yeah, and ultimately, I guess I would warn you all, if it's pushing up on 2 years, that's just way too long. That's something I had to learn just with time and experience as an author. It's unprofessional for to go on that long. Okay, second question. An anonymous attendee has asked, during the peer review process, has the author ever been asked to redo their research or data collection as a result of the reviews they've received? Yeah. And sometimes you as an author have to decide, can I commit to that? And I know one time I had a preliminary inclusion in a pretty good journal, but one of the reviewers just insisted, you need to go back and do this huge data collection that honestly it would have taken me a year to do, and I just can't do it. So I had to withdraw my article. So that's happened to me. What about you two?
Yeah. So generally I kind of think about that as I take a look at the feedback first and thinking, are they seeing something that I'm not? Is this something that I can actually accomplish? Or is this reviewer two expecting me to write the paper or conduct the research that they would have conducted or that they want to see conducted, rather than the research that I actually conducted myself? So typically when that happens, for me at least, it's a bit of a reflective process on whether the feedback is actually founded and grounded and whether they read the paper or whether they're just, maybe that's just one of those negative, unhelpful reviews, at which point I would pull my paper and seek another journal. That's my process when that kind of thing happens, because very often that's very unrealistic and it's work that is maybe unachievable, especially if it involves new data collection or using a different data set. But if it's a matter of, this particular statistical test would be really helpful and strengthen your paper, that's different. But if they're asking you to redo everything, that's not generally, I don't feel that's reasonable.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. One thing maybe to add is sometimes you get a right of reply as an author. And if you think a reviewer has completely missed the point, you can say so in your response to the reviews. And sometimes you may be able to convince the editor and the reviewer, because as a reviewer, you'll get the author's feedback to your review. And if they're contesting your review, you might be convinced in some respects, or you might think, no, I'm right. This needs redoing. And that might be the point at which the author withdraws the article and maybe tries it with a different journal, because asking for changes of that level is obviously a huge amount of work. So I think it'd be more likely that would be a rejection from the reviewer if they were saying you need to redo your research. That's too much to expect for major revisions for most research projects, I'd say.
So the order of the questions are bouncing around with people voting. Okay, how about this one? As someone who is working towards submitting their first paper for publication, I am obviously anxious to get it right. I was considering contacting some lecturers or authors to ask them to look over my work, kind of as a pre-peer review before submission. Is this appropriate? Would somebody be offended or upset by contacting them? And there isn't really anyone from my past qualifications who would feel comfortable reviewing, because they're doing work with speciesism. That's normal. It's totally normal practice to reach out to scholars that you think would have some feedback. do need to be mindful of their time. I know Peter Singer, for instance, has a thing on his website, like just basically saying, students, please do not contact me. I'm just too busy. But I know when people who are hoping to publish send stuff to me, I'm always happy when I have time to offer that. But yeah, just be mindful that we're all very, very busy folks, and we have lots of reading we have to do for other stuff.
Yeah, and people like being asked for their opinion. Generally, it's nice if someone thinks, oh yeah, they want my opinion. I'm like, oh, cool. So yeah, if I've got time, I do it too. But time is the thing, yeah.
Rochelle?
Yeah, I think that it's also one of those ways that you can start to build your network. It's one of those ways that you can start to establish those relationships within the discipline. And I think as long as you're doing the request respectfully and understanding that they might say no, then absolutely reach out to folks for sure.
Yeah, actually, those points you guys made are very, very relevant. So I know me, when I was younger, I would be afraid. But now I realize it's a very efficient way of networking, absolutely. And now when I finish my research, I also send it off to people in hopes that they'll just look at it. So yeah, go for it, try it out. Okay, that's some excellent questions, folks. How do you know how strict to be in your review, depending on the type of journal or outlet that asks you for your review? For example, if the journal that asks you to make a review is small or not well rated, should you be less rigorous, and in what way? And how do you know the limits? I would say no matter what, you can come in with full professionalism. And if you're going to do it, right? Don't come in just kind of, no matter what, especially when we were talking about our politics of we're hoping to build our field. We're passionate about supporting others who do critical animal studies and vegan sociology. I don't care if it's the lowest ranked journal on the whole planet. I know that person has put a lot of time into it, and I'm there to offer my, if I'm going to commit, I'm committing, in other words.
Yeah, and that's how you can help a journal improve its reputation too. You know, the higher quality of the work, it will rise. They don't all stay the same forever in a fixed hierarchy. So yeah.
Rochelle?
I think that is pretty much bang on. I feel like it's your own professionalism that you're putting forward, and it's about building your own skills as a reviewer, as well as, again, providing support and strengthening the scholar's work that you're reviewing.
Yeah, so like I said, I oftentimes go with the open access, low ranked journals just because, I'm interested in the field, my field, building it. Here's one that's got bumped to the top. As a young researcher, how can I tell if it's my lack of expertise that makes me misunderstand the argument, or if the argument is poorly written? I am expected to read every theoretical framework the author mentions, even if I'm familiar with some of it, not all. No, once again, don't speak the stuff you don't know about, and you just be open in the reviews. Say this is what I do know, and here's what I can speak to, and here's what I can't speak to. And I say that even to the author, not just the editor. Just let them know, just full disclosure.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you'll read something in a paper and you think, well, this is amazing. I've never heard of this. I need to go and read it, but not as a kind of a way of feeling like, oh, I have to know this in order to comment, but because you're genuinely interested and you're going to learn from it, and maybe that will inform your comments. But if you don't know, you don't know, and say that, comment on what you know about, and don't attempt to cover your limitations. That's not what's expected. I mean, we all learn through this process. We all grow through it. We all develop as academics all the time, and that never stops. No one ever knows everything about everything, no matter what your reputation or standing, or no matter how many things you've published or whatever. So yeah, be honest.
And I would suggest that that's also being honest about that is also part of your ethical responsibility as a reviewer, and recognizing that your time has limits, because if you are expecting yourself to go and learn all about the theoretical framework, then you're adding hours and hours to your review process, and that's not reasonable, and it's also not expected. Again, like Corey and Matthew mentioned, speak directly to your area of expertise and just be really honest with yourself about some of those, about what you can't comment on.
All right, here's a question I really like, because I wish someone had we should ask someone earlier. Is it necessary to take into account all the comments of the reviewers? What if you disagree with some of the comments? When I first started out, like, okay, I gotta do it all. The first thing that I do go through my reviews and I create a bullet list of here's the things that I need to accomplish, organized by reviewer. But ultimately, you're the expert. And sometimes you will have people who are reviewing who aren't exactly in your field. They are kind of periphery. And you have to trust your own expertise sometimes. And as we were mentioning earlier, sometimes they do make some, I'm sorry, I'm not going to throw out this whole content analysis it took me a year to go do another one that they want me to do. That's just not realistic. Or when you can tell that they don't really know anything about the theory that you're working with, and they're telling you need to do this and that and that. So you need to trust your gut and trust your own expertise and your own knowledge. That said, you also need to be humble, because I would say most of the time the reviewers are right. So what you're expected to do is that you have to, I didn't mention this part, but from the author point of view, they're expected when they submit that revision to submit a statement to explain what they revised, how and why. And there's always room for you to say, there's too much conflict between these reviewer A and reviewer B. I have to make a decision on what I'm going to adjust. And then sometimes you may say, no, I really do think that this is important to leave as is.
So I would just say, in addition to that, is that if you are not going to be addressing the feedback in the way that the reviewer is asking you to, that you justify that response. So if you say, there's a conflict between reviewer A and reviewer B's comments fit much more clearly in line with my method and scope, and it strengthened the paper. So explaining why you picked particular things, or if you're refusing to do the feedback, or if you are not going to be incorporating that feedback, that you explain clearly why. So this was the comment. I feel that the paper is stronger with it as is because, and you clearly provide evidence and reasonable arguments as to why you're not going to be doing that, basically justifying your decision. Yeah, but within reason. Sorry.
And a good reviewer should be persuadable by a sound argument from the author. And one thing, when you write your review, you don't see the other reviews at that stage, but you will see the other reviews when the revisions come in. And at that point, you can look at another reviewer's comments and say, oh yeah, I didn't, I missed that, or I didn't understand that properly. So maybe I was wrong about that. So if that happens, of course, you're persuadable by the author saying, well, the other reviewer said this. So, and you go, yeah, fair enough. So that can happen as well. So it's a negotiation, it's an iterative process going through revisions and reviews.
Okay, here I have a couple of questions now that are a little easier to answer. One is asking, do you feel like you always have to say something just because it's expected? You have to give some kind of feedback just because it's expected, or can you say this is great and no change? I think the easy answer to that is, yeah, if you feel like doesn't need to change, it doesn't need to change. But like I said in my part of the presentation, it's a bit of a unicorn. Usually there's something, because no one person knows everything. And this is a collaborative experience. It's very rare for that to happen. But yeah, if you really do not see an issue, don't lie, don't make stuff up, don't make busy work. Does anyone else have anything on that, or I'll jump to the next one?
Well, just to quickly say, remember, you're not alone as a reviewer. There's at least one other reviewer. So even if you haven't got anything, someone else might. So don't feel like you have to force it just so there's something.
Yeah. And I like this next question is, do we have the same reviewers on different journals? If an author withdraws and submits elsewhere, that has happened to me, because it was actually for a book. I sent it and it got rejected pretty quick the second time around, like within 24 hours. And it's like, there's no way that that person read this whole book proposal in less than 24 hours. It was the same reviewer. As far as the journals, the journals keep databases of reviewers. And so we are all parts of multiple journals. So it's possible. What do you guys think about the ethics of that, about reviewing a second time?
I would refuse to review that. I would just simply say that I've reviewed this for another journal, or I would just refuse the review. As a reviewer, I feel like that's my responsibility, or if I feel that it's a better fit for the journal, I might, but it would really kind of depend on the paper and the reason why. If the person pulled their paper, that would be different, as opposed to if it was a reject. So again, but my personal ethics would be, it would just not really feel right for me to do that.
Me too. Yeah. It hasn't.
Okay. Yeah, it's one time. No, it happened to me one time, and I think I just wrote to the editor. I don't think I actually. I shared the last review I gave of it, so I didn't make up a new one. Okay, we're running short on time, so I'm gonna maybe ask 2 more of these questions, and then I think we can answer them after the fact, right? Okay, so here's a good one. What qualifications does the reviewer need? How is the case of a reviewer having less experience in the field than the author avoided? Well, it's not avoided. The only qualifications you need is that you feel confident that you can respond to this, but you have to be mindful, like I said, that the peer review situation now, we have a glut of journals. More and more people are required to publish more and more in earlier stages in their career in order to get a job and to keep a job and get promoted. And fewer people are being rewarded for service work of reviewing. So what's happening then is that more and more grad students are being asked to do review service when they maybe don't have a lot of expertise. So you just really have to trust your own professionalism, I would say. Anything from you guys?
No, I agree. I think that's part of the ethical process of approaching a review. You know, am I qualified to do it? Is something that you need to reflect on. You know your own expertise, your own limitations, but don't feel like you're not qualified in a formal sense. If you've been invited and you're working in that field, then there's a strong chance that you are qualified. If it's not, as Corey was saying, a sort of spammed request for reviews from some journal that just kind of asked every academic on the planet. If it's been targeted at you, then, you know, you probably are qualified, and embrace that.
Yeah, because if you didn't register and you've just been plucked for this journal, someone must have suggested you. Or sometimes editors will look at the authors who've been cited in that work, or, you know, authors who've written on that topic before. That's how I get picked a lot. Okay, how about this last question? And this one is just a very basic one. How do you know what the quality of the journal is? How do you tell what the ranking is? And is there any professional disadvantage for reviewing low ranking journals for too long into your career? What do you guys think?
I think that's a tricky one in terms of reviewing low-ranking journals. I think that I try to engage with a mix. So if a journal approaches me and I have the expertise and the time to do the review, I will generally say yes, because for me, my priority is about supporting scholars and supporting the field. And I mean, I look at the intersection between intimate partner violence and animal abuse as my primary research kind of framework. So they're not so thick on the ground that there's other folks who can be doing the reviews, and we publish in a variety of different journals, everything from like social work to criminology and everything in between. So if I was only going to be looking at the high ranking journals, I wouldn't be doing very many reviews, which means that I really wouldn't be doing my service that I feel is necessary to my discipline and my research fields. It just kind of depends on where you are and what you feel comfortable with. If you're holding out for only those high ranking journals, your reviews are likely going to be of a lower number. And there's no guarantee on the quality of the paper that you're going to be getting, or even the quality of the review that you're going to be giving. So I think, as Matthew mentioned, that's an opportunity for you to raise the profile of some of those maybe lower ranking journals by putting in amazing work that's been well reviewed, good constructive criticism, and really strengthened, that'll help increase the profile of not only the scholar, but also the journal.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah, I think I review primarily because I'm interested in the abstract that I've been sent as the first thing. And what journal it's in is a secondary consideration for me. And it's rare that I'm in a situation where I've got competing offers or requests for reviews, and I think, well, should I do the higher ranked journal one? Maybe I've been lucky, but they tend to come kind of sequentially. Like I get an invite, and then a couple of weeks later, I'll get another one. So then it's a question of, am I interested and do I have time? If it's yes to both, I'll do it without really worrying about what journal it's for. But I certainly think there's no disadvantage. No one's kind of monitoring this and think, you're only reviewing for low ranked journals, therefore there's some kind of a mark against you. That's certainly not the case, I don't think. I think you always benefit from the process. You always learn from doing it. So there's no reason not to, as long as you're competent and have time and can do a good job. It's a great thing to do if you can.
All right. Well, we are, I think, out of time, everyone. And I want to thank you all for hanging in there and asking such really amazing questions. So I think there was a few that we didn't have time to get to. And so what we'll do is since this lecture was recorded, we'll be able to go back and look at those questions and respond to them on the Canadian Sociological Association's website. We may cross-post those on the Vegan Sociology website as well, vegansociology.com. So thank you all very, very much. And thanks also to Rochelle and to Matthew for your amazing expertise. Like I said, I've also learned quite a lot. And I like this kind of ethic of care and professionalism that we're putting behind our peer review work. Hopefully you guys are all inspired to go do good things in the world and support your fields. All right. Okay, well, let's wrap it up. And thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great day.